All right, Yankai, take it away.
All yours.
Sure, thank you. So before we start our presentation, I would like to acknowledge that the UBC Vancouver's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and the caretakers of those lands. So now should we start to introduce ourselves? Or maybe let me introduce the speakers.
That sounds great.
Okay, so so let me introduce the three speakers. The first speaker is Katie Marshall, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Zoology. Her interests are in modeling the complexity of insect stress responses, overwintering, physiological ecology, and the macro physiology in the context of climate change. So she will talk about the poop from the biological perspective. And then the second speaker is Tamara Michelle. She is an assistant professor of Spanish in Department of French, Hispanic, and Italian Studies, where she teaches Latin American literature and culture. Her research examines the relationship between aesthetics, politics, and the literature tradition, with a focus on contemporary Mexican and Central American novels. Today she will talk about poop from the cultural perspective. And the last speaker is myself, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering. And my research interest is in large-scale modeling and optimization, control, and data analytics. So I will talk about poop from the mathematical perspective. So now I guess Tamara will explain the structure of this event.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us. And we want to start out with just a lightning round of trivia. And our trivia is on topic, so it's poop related. And we'll just ask you to post your answer in the chat. Sometimes if it's a tough question, we give you a little bit of a hint. So if there's radio silence, we'll prompt you with some ideas. And if you happen to get the answer correct at the end, make sure to email me, because we have prizes, poop-related prizes, in fact, for people who provide the correct answer. So I'll put my email address in the chat. It's also on our last slide. So Katie, if you want to go to the next slide. All right. So does anybody know the name of the artist of this 1991 sculpture? And if you happen to know the title of the piece, extra bonus point. Does anybody know who made this sculpture? All right, we'll do some hints. Okay, so we have 4 possibilities. We've got Mike Kelly, Cindy Sherman, John Miller, and Andres Serrano. Anybody have a guess? It's not, holy crap. It's not Cindy Sherman, although Cindy Sherman loves the abject photos, right? Cindy Sherman loves abject art. It's not Andres Serrano. You're looking at my Hispanic studies stuff and going with Andres. John Miller!
Woo!
Does anybody know what it's called?
Oh, sorry.
That's totally fine. Dick Jane. Nope, that's perfect. Yeah, so
right.
It's questioning gender roles, right? So we read Dick Jane to learn when we're young, but we also learn about gender roles from Dick Jane. And so it's kind of upsetting that. Okay, so next trivia. What name did Duchamp sign on his famous 1916 piece, The Fountain? We got some French people in here. What's the name that he put on his sculpture? Anybody? Oh, colleagues. That's about the right amount of letters, Ewan. It's an initial and then a last name. Does that help? Ah. Oh! Oh, so close. Excellent. Next slide, I think, has the picture of it, right?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, so the urinal kind of got gallery goers to question what counts as art, no? So, all right. The next slide is going to be, I believe they're in, this is Yankai's question, no? So a single dairy cow produces how many kilos of manure per day, which is about what percentage of the weight of an average cow? Maybe we could do closest guesses. Okay, so put in 2 numbers and the amount of kilos that you think that the cow produces per day and the percentage of the weight of an average cow. And whoever gets it closest will get a poop prize. They're great prizes. Okay.
Oh, 50%. Good,
guesses.
Good call, Bill.
Put numbers in.
Yeah, just do it.
I like it. Good.
It's quite the range.
I know, this is great.
5,
5, 10. Okay, we might have to review this at the end. But we'll save a transcript of the chat. It'll be a cliffhanger.
Yeah. All right. What do you think? Shall we reveal the answer?
All right, let's show the answer.
Okay.
62 kilos.
So 6%. Yep. So we had definitely, yeah, some close ones, but yeah.
All right.
I'll let you sort that out, Tammy, which one's correct.
I'm saving the chat right now.
All right.
I'll let you do this because I don't know how to pronounce the word.
Sure. What is the scientific name for this rock of biological origins? And the shape should be a clue to you. And keep in mind with rocks, there's a common ending when we're talking about rock names. So. Also think a little bit about potentially Latin names for feces, and that may provide you with some clues as well. Let's see the chat. Yeah, Karen, that's right. It is a coprolite.
Oh, I would have said coprolite.
Well done. Yeah. And these are often studied to learn about the diets of extinct animals, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is one of my favorites. There's a few pitcher plant species in Borneo, and they've actually evolved to provide a perfect toilet for a few species of shrew. And it basically, on the right-hand side, you'll see the shrew is licking some really tasty nectar while simultaneously defecating into the pitcher plant. And the pitcher plant feeds off of the nutrient-rich feces. So what's a term for this kind of ecological relationship? Yeah, I don't know if I would quite call it a symbiosis. You have to have really, really close, a close sort of association. I guess the pitcher plant relies on the shrew, but the shrew doesn't necessarily rely on the pitcher plant for its sustenance. So think a little bit broader than symbiosis, and I would probably put it in that broader category, but not maybe a symbiosis. Although if you wanted to argue it with me, Bill, I would be happy to also argue it. So he has said a symbiosis. But I would, yeah, Alara, that's what I would do. I would call it a mutualism. Just because the shrew is not reliant on the pitcher plant for its entire sustenance, while the pitcher plant is reliant on the shrew. So, okay. And that's what happens in these really nutrient poor cloud forests in Borneo, so where every nutrient is at its prime. So at this point, we're going to branch off into a few individual talks. And so I wanted to start off in true sort of comparative physiology fashion by showing some of the diversity of animal feces that are out there. And feces in general, they reflect things like the way the digestive system of an organism functions, the diet it's on, but they also tell us and show us a little bit about the importance of feces within ecosystem functioning. So you might have some guesses as to which animals these various feces came from. In the top left, we have bear feces. And one of the things I find really interesting about bear feces is that one of the animals we think about bears feeding on are salmon. Now, salmon migrate when it's time to spawn from the ocean to freshwater systems. And if they're very unlucky along the way, they get caught by a bear, and the bear then eats the fish and defecates in the forest. And really bear feces then sort of represents this link between ocean nutrient systems and land terrestrial nutrient ecosystems. And we get this flow of nutrients from the ocean onto the land because of bear feces. In the top right, this is a cassowary, and this is cassowary droppings. And cassowaries eat a wide variety of seeds, and there are several plants that are actually entirely dependent on being eaten by a cassowary and then defecated out across the landscape for the dispersal of their young. So if plants didn't have this happen, they would not be able to spread themselves across an entire landscape. And so cassowaries kind of represent this nutrient, this seed dispersal importance on a landscape. In the bottom left, we have elephant dung, and elephant dung is incredibly nutrient rich. And not only is that important for exactly where they are, for the nutrients that land there, they also can actually structure the plant growth of entire tropical ecosystems. And so the dispersal by large mammals, especially of dung, can just really supplement the nutrients given in a given area. And then finally, here in the bottom right, these are worm castings, and worms, of course, are important soil aerators, improving the fertility of soils. So you can see dung kind of plays this essential role across many systems. Where does dung come from? Well, and why do we poop? Well, it's undigested food. And in general, when we talk about dung and we talk about digestion, there's really a couple of processes that are important. First, the chemical digestion that happens. So we encounter mechanical and chemical forces in our digestive system. And then secondly, the absorption that happens of those nutrients. So when you think about the digestive system, we first digest, and then we absorb nutrients, and whatever we can't absorb is eliminated in waste. So we can even look at a human digestive system, right? Food comes through the mouth, and the first digestion happens there mechanically and enzymatically, goes down into the stomach, then hits the small intestine. And despite the name, the small intestine is actually quite a bit longer than the large intestine. The larger small really just tells us about the diameter of the two. In the small intestine, digestion continues, and we have some absorption starting. And then finally, in the large intestine, we have some more absorption, but really a lot of absorption of water. So ideally, our bodies are retaining as much nutrient as possible and as much water as possible from the food that we ingest. And the large intestine, I think, is really kind of a fascinating organ. It looks pretty straightforward. It's just a tube, but there's an incredible amount of biochemistry that happens in the large intestine, and a lot of water and electrolyte absorption that goes on here. And what we're learning is that there's also quite a lot more digestion than we originally thought, due to the community of bacteria that live in our large intestine. These help break down a little bit of an undigested food and really start modifying sort of our ability to obtain nutrients from the environment. And I think this is really fascinating. We're not just sort of a single organism. We are an ecosystem. We have a huge amount of organisms that live within us, and that really affect our health in ways that we're just starting to understand as biologists. So we have many types of bacteria in the large intestine. There's thought to be about 500 species, but that varies from person to person. I've seen incredible papers where they looked at the composition of that community and looked how it shifted actually as people visited other countries and ate different diets. And so it's a relatively stable, but can be perturbed by things like a gastrointestinal illness or a big or quick diet change. And we have a truly symbiotic relationship. If our gut bacteria is not working well, we are in really poor health. And our gut bacteria obviously relies on us to provide a nice warm home with lots of nutrients. We go and find the nutrients for those bacteria. And these bacteria also repress the growth of pathogenic microbes. And so hospital-acquired infections like C. difficile, which really set up shop in our large intestine, are really quite damaging. So why is poop the way it is? So the color comes from a compound called stercobilin, which is a compound that results from the breakdown of heme and red blood cells. And so our body is just able to get rid of it in poop, and that's why it's brown. The smell is from a molecule that I really love. It's called scatol, and the name literally comes from scat, which is Greek for feces. And this is a tryptophan breakdown byproduct. So tryptophan is a really common amino acid in our bodies. And what's amazing about poop is that it actually contains quite a lot of nutrients still. Our bodies are pretty amazing, but they can't absorb every potential bit of chemical energy from our food. And so whatever is left over does end up in our feces. And so ends up being a really kind of potential source of nutrients for other organisms in the environment. And that's why it plays this important role in nutrient cycling. So poop's incredibly useful for humans, and I'm just going to go over some of the ways that we have historically and currently use poop. Obviously, it's an incredible fertilizer. This woman grew these peppers here in Haiti by using human waste as a fertilizer when it's appropriately treated. One of the most interesting things I found is we're now using dung for human food production by feeding the dung to soldier fly larvae, which are then fed to chickens, which are then fed to humans. We can actually use dung in kind of a closed system that is actually, we don't worry about the movement of pathogenesis across so many different species. It's been used as building material, as bricks since time immemorial. It's a potential source of energy. One of the uses that is new to me is actually using finding scat and sequencing the DNA within it to get a better sense of what animals are currently on the landscape. So for rare species, we might actually be able to detect them only through their poop rather than by actually finding the animal. What I really was surprised by as well was that feces can be used as a precious metal source. So sewage treatment plants from at city scale, if they are set up to extract precious metals from that sewage, the estimate from the USDA is about $13 million a year in precious metals could be extracted from the sewage of a city of 1 million. And so this figure here in the middle is showing some of these precious metals extracted from sewage. And then finally, in cases of really recalcitrant C. difficile infection, so Clostridium difficile, this bacteria on the right, poop transplants from healthy donors can be used to repopulate their gut with healthy bacteria that outcompete the pathogenic bacteria. So as much as poop is a waste byproduct, it's also something that's incredibly useful for us. I want to just take a few minutes at the end to talk about some of the research I've been doing on dung beetles. This is the rainbow scarab, Phineas vindex. And dung beetles as a whole are really important ecosystem service providers. So they manage to alter the ecosystem in a way that's really quite beneficial for humans and other species. They help fertilize the soil by moving dung around the landscape away from the source. And the degradation of dung that they do, it's believed to be worth about $300 million a year to cattle farmers in the United States alone, let alone across the world. And Phineas vindex is not one of the rolling dung beetles that you may have seen. Like, I think those are the ones that are kind of famous. What they do, they're tunnelers. And so they bring dung down these long tunnels and they lay their eggs in it. And the larvae use the dung as a food source. And Phineas vindex itself is found across eastern and southern North America, from just kind of the border of Canada all the way down quite deep into Mexico. And I think they're really interesting for their ecological role, but they're also interesting because they experience a wide variety of thermal variability. So when they're up on the surface, they experience quite a lot of thermal extremes. And when they're down underground, they experience very stable temperatures. So I've been lucky enough to work with some great dung beetle experts, Kimberly Sheldon and her postdoctoral fellow Amanda Carter at the University of Tennessee. We were interested in how differences in variability, temperature variability, impact the metabolism and the physiology of these dung beetles. And I'm just going to show you one result from this paper. I could spend a whole hour talking about it. But what I found when I looked at gene expression in this species was a whole bunch of genes that were upregulated. So these are the genes on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have how much those genes were upregulated in response to high temperature variation and moderate temperature variation. What is the importance of these genes? Well, these are all genes that control how tightly packed DNA is. And so by upregulating these genes, this would, we believe, would promote a more unpacked chromatin structure. So DNA would be unwound from around its histones and more available to transcription. So this makes sense. If you want to be really well adapted for a really thermally variable environment, by relaxing your DNA structure such that it's easy to transcribe lots of new genes, you've actually set yourself up pretty well to be very flexible and able to respond to environmental challenges. So another piece of work that Kimberly and her postdoctoral fellow Amanda did was they looked at how this temperature variability changed the adult mass of the beetles. And they found under high temperature variability that you would get a much smaller beetle than at low temperature variability. And this was actually coupled with a decrease in metabolic rate, which was really quite confusing to us. And we're still trying to understand how temperature variability really affects both physiology and fitness in this beetle. But we've decided to expand a little bit and start looking at questions across larger spatial scales. And so dung beetles are found from North America through to South America. And as we go from more temperate regions, so such as here in Arizona, we've got on this map, versus Ecuador, you can see in Ecuador in blue, the temperatures are much more stable than they are in Arizona, which is in the gray. And so we have matched pairs of species across these different tribes of beetles, where we're going to ask the question, how do they start responding to temperature variation? So are those underlying mechanisms similar or different between tropical and temperate species? How those mechanisms affect whole organism responses to temperature variation, and whether or not those responses can offset some of those energetic demands of temperature variation, and how do they maintain fitness in those environments? We're just starting some of this work now, and we're really excited to see how it comes out. So I hope I've convinced you over the last 12 minutes or so that poop is a very rich topic. And I worked really hard to only have a few very small puns, but I wanted to bring that one in. And so this cartoon here on the right comes from a paper a few years ago in PNAS, looking at the role of feces produced by large mammals in the way that nutrient cycling works across the planet. And they found with the extinction of many large mammal species that we actually have huge reductions in how many nutrients make their way from the ocean to land and vice versa. So I really like the punchline here. Extinction isn't just about the loss of important species, it's also about the loss of feces. So if I've left you with anything, it's that poop plays an essential role in ecosystems and life cycle completion, like seed dispersal, pathogenesis, and nutrient recycling and movement. And as our world becomes smaller, I think it becomes really important to understand how to protect and enhance these cycles, not just for our own species, but for species across the planet. And it's time potentially to revisit the uses of this waste. So I'd like to thank my funding sources and my lab and all of you for listening to my mini talk. I wish I could talk a whole talk on probably every slide here, but hopefully it wasn't too quick, and thank you so much. I will leave it to Tammy.
Thanks, Katie. That's great. Okay, so we're making a sharp turn to literature. And share my PowerPoint. Okay. All right. So my talk today is called Internalizing the Abject, Poop as Politics in Peruvian Narrative. So today I'll be discussing the 1958 novel Los Ríos Profundos, or Deep Rivers. Let's see, there we go. By Peruvian novelist Jose Maria Arguedas. Told from the perspective of Ernesto, a mestizo boy enrolled at a Catholic boys' school in Abancay, Peru, The novel obliquely reveals the hierarchical social relations of mid-20th century Peru by cataloging the social and political privilege of the white upper class in contrast to the discrimination and mistreatment of the indigenous sector of society. The presentation considers the role of the abject and the scatological, stuff related to poop, as markers of social class in mid-20th century Peruvian society. The abject is a term that Julia Kristeva uses to understand what is lost or cast aside in subject formation. It is that part of ourselves that we violently expel in order to become an I. I'll come back to this later, but an important note is that for Kristeva, the abject is part, although an excluded and detested part of the subject. So my talk has two main objectives. First, I show how Deep Rivers deploys the category of the abject to critique political agency and the social system in mid-20th century Peru. I present how the narrative makes visible the extreme social stratification of Peruvian society by creating an extended allegory between the scatological, so feces, filth, bodily secretions, and the marginalized citizens of the social body, namely women and indigenous peoples. Much like the human waste of the biological body, the abject citizens in Peru are expelled and maintained apart from the social interior, which is reflected not only in their physical state, but also in their lack of political agency. As the narrative unveils this correlation, it also exposes how the social boundary between the white ruling class and the non-white subjugated Peruvians is enforced and reproduced time and again by the former. As my talk shows, this enforcement occurs when the ruling class, the landowners, military, and Catholic Church, whether as a means of maintaining or recuperating social order, invokes and reproduces the scatological association that they think differentiates them from the lower class. By displaying the processes of association, I evidence the artificiality of the boundary that defines this differentiation. The second objective of my presentation is to demonstrate how this social boundary is not only artificial, but is also imminently vulnerable. This vulnerability is exposed in the imperfect attempts on the part of the ruling class to deny their own association with the abject, both in terms of abject bodily secretions and the abject humans that have been expelled from the society. After all, as Taro Gomi reminds us, everyone poops. As the social order in Deep Rivers breaks down, the ruling class's attempts at denying their relationship with the abject fail. This vulnerability gives rise to the potential for political rupture in the form of those abject humans forcibly re-entering the privileged interior that has been denied to them. The first chapter of Deep Rivers introduces one of the most shocking figures of abjection in the Pongo, an indigenous house servant. His filth is rivaled only by his submissiveness, and our narrator Ernesto's first impression of him is that he is, quote, like a worm that begs to be squished, unquote. The Pongo is exemplary of the role of abjection in Peruvian society, as his malnourishment, timidity, and dirtiness are contrasted with the wealth and authority of his master, El Viejo, or the old man, who is a respected Catholic churchgoer and landowner in Cuzco. He's also kind of a jerk. With the Pongo's worn out clothes, his hair, quote, messy and covered in grime, unquote, El Pongo is a repulsive, pitiful figure. This vileness is symbolic of the repulsion that the ruling class manifests toward the indigenous sector of society. Judith Butler explains the function of repulsion in the formation of social identities, saying that, quote, the operation of repulsion can consolidate identities founded on the instituting of the other, or a set of others through exclusion and domination. What constitutes through division the inner and outer worlds of the subject is a border and boundary tenuously maintained for the purposes of social regulation and control. In effect, this is the mode by which others become shit, unquote. The effectiveness of this expulsion and repulsion is evidenced in the behavior and the speech of El Pongo. When Ernesto attempts to speak with him in Cuzco, he replies with manan, a form of negation in Quechua that, according to Argueda scholar Julio Ortega, signals that the speaker, quote, lacks a role in communication that would distinguish him as a speaking subject. His own role as servant excludes him from speech itself, which terrifies him, unquote. Ortega's interpretation echoes Aristotle's well-known formulation of mere voice in contrast to political speech, and underscores the efficacy of repulsion as explained by Butler, as the Pongo's physical state corresponds to his lack of political agency and social status. El Pongo is emblematic of the exploitative relationship that the ruling class maintains with the abject castes in the social system. El Pongo is a colono, or an indigenous worker from the hacienda, who works in the Cuzco home of the old man. His role as servant, like the labor of the colonos on the plantation, is an integral part of the old man's social status. The Quechua colonos' near enslavement allows the old man to accumulate significant wealth and respect. They function in society as a necessary but exploited workforce, but their masters maintain them apart and deny them worth and political agency. The case of Laupa Marcelina, a kitchen servant in the Abancay Catholic school, is exemplary of the conflicted relationship between the ruling class and the abject outcasts. Laupa is described as a demented white woman, and like El Pongo, she is filthy and unkempt. Despite her mental disability and physical appearance, she is the object of the students' and one of the priests' sexual desire, and the boys frequently take turns raping her. In relation to today's talk, the most striking aspect of this violation is that it takes place in the school's latrines. Ernesto describes the latrines as, quote, a wicked space whose stench weighed down on us, unquote. And the students who participate in and view the act walk away feeling contaminated. This ambivalent relationship with an abject member of society reveals what Cristeva calls, quote, the objective frailty of symbolic order, unquote, and opens the clean interior to the possibility of defilement by the expelled abject. Cristeva maintains that this frailty and the potential for defilement are unavoidable for two reasons. First, the abject material was once a part of the interior, and although it is expelled, it actually pertains to the original system. And second, the boundary between the abject and the clean interior is artificial. Ironically, the clean interior then uses this arbitrary, artificial boundary to distinguish itself from the abject exterior. Along these lines, Cristeva reminds us that, quote, filth is not a quality in itself, but it applies only to what relates to a boundary, and more particularly, represents the object jettisoned out of that boundary, its other side, a margin, unquote. The aporia of this system is that the boundary is only possible due to the existence of that abject material that has been expelled from the interior, that the identity of the accepted interior is based on the very existence of the abject that it seeks to maintain apart. Butler refers to Cristeva's notion of the abject to show how the human biological body stands as a sort of synecdoche for the social body. Butler posits that, much like the human body, the social body has accepted contours and regulated sites of permeability and impermeability. When sites of impermeability are transgressed, this opens the social body up to dangerous contamination. Like Cristeva's understanding of the abject, boundaries in Butler's configuration of the social body are constructed and artificial, and these boundaries are disrupted when unsanctioned permeability occurs. In the section that follows, I present 2 episodes from Deep Rivers in which a social boundary is established and is later threatened. In both episodes, scatological elements are employed to demarcate a social boundary and then are redeployed by the ruling class in an attempt to maintain and regulate the social boundary. The first instance of unregulated permeability occurs when Las Chicheras, the female bar owners of Huanapata, steal salt that has been stockpiled for the landowner's use. Ernesto participates in the revolt, in which the women take up arms, accuse authorities of stealing salt from the people, and chant and march in an organized fashion. Unlike El Pongo, who lacks political agency and whose submissive manan abnegates his place in society, Las chicheras appropriate the same manan, but with the performative function of saying enough is enough. Doña Felipa, the leader of the revolt, leads the women and Ernesto to Patibamba, the plantation community of the colonos, to distribute salt to the hacienda workers. When Ernesto arrives, the abject state of the community stands in stark contrast to the nearby hacienda mansion, which is guarded by armed men by a barred fence. The village huts, meanwhile, are fetid and infested with wasps, and the streets are covered with treacle and human excrement, a telling mixture of the sugar plantation where they labor and the scatological material that represents their social status. The indigenous workers are too frightened to leave their homes and only emerge after much prodding from Las Chicheras. They receive their salt and hurry back inside. This offense, accepting salt from Las Chicheras, is countered once the women leave Patibamba. Officials go into the community with whips and take back the salt, and then Father Linares, the director of Ernesto's school, delivers a sermon meant to chastise the colonos and cause them to repent. He takes particular pleasure in making the laborers cry, and he preaches, quote, "We have come here to weep, to suffer, so that the spines might pierce our heart as they did to the Holy Mother. The world is a vale of tears for the poor creatures of Patibamba," unquote. Causing the colonos to weep represents an additional manner of excluding them from the body politic. According to Kristeva, tears are not repulsive like other bodily secretions, but they do share similarities with the abject, as they are expelled from the body. The Patibamba sermon, meant to victimize and gain obedience, stands in sharp contrast to a sermon that Father Linares later delivers to the boys at the Catholic school. Ernesto compares the two sermons, noting, quote, "This time, Father Linares spoke to us in a different way. Maybe it was just me, but the Quechua he spoke to the colonos provoked a bitterness in me. Could he have multiple spirits? I wondered, listening to him in the chapel. He doesn't try to make us weep. He doesn't seek to humiliate us, pull our hearts from our chest and throw it in the mud where the sugarcane worms crawl. Instead, he inspires us," unquote. The tactics that Father Linares employs to maintain the boundary between those who form part of the accepted interior and those expelled from Abancay society are clear. He speaks to the colonos in Quechua, an unofficial language in Peru at the time, and seeks to victimize in Patibamba. Meanwhile, in the Catholic school, his sermon enlivens and inspires and is delivered in Spanish, the recognized lengua franca. Later, the military seeks to quash the Chichera rebellion. After taking the salt to the colonos of Patibamba, the women return to the city center and continue their march and outspoken demands. The colonel arrives with troops from Cuzco to suppress the rebellion. Instead of submitting to the military, however, the Chicheras resist, and the colonel metes out startling punishment. Quote, "He whipped their backsides in front of their husbands. The women wore no underwear so you could see everything. The soldiers stuffed feces in their mouths," unquote. The Chicheras' transgression, enacting political and social rights that they are not entitled to in the eyes of the ruling class, earns them punishment that is aimed at reminding them of their abject, marginalized status in society. The women in the public witnessing the punishment are reminded of the Chicheras' biological sex and their inferior position to men. What's more, the troops whip them on their exposed backsides, the corporeal site of abject expulsion, and stuff feces in their mouths in an attempt to quiet the political voice that these women have no right to utter. This scene does not end in the women's silence, however, and one woman's response stands out in particular. She screams in defiance, quote, "Don't make me swallow the little colonel's shit. It's shit. It's shit. It must have been shit. Did they bring the shit from Cuzco? Oh, how well they squeezed the filth out of him. By God, hooray for the one who did it. That's how the little colonel gave birth," end quote. So she's mocking him. In addition to taunting the colonel with the diminutive coronelcito, she reminds the troops that he too shits and emasculates him by comparing the act to giving birth. The Chichera unmasks the artificial difference that the patriarchy has worked so hard to establish. After the military gains control of Abancay, the women who took part in the revolt are banished from the city. Order appears to have been reestablished in the hands of the white male leaders of the community. However, a plague soon arrives, taking hold in the colonos villages outside the city. In an effort to hold the plague and the colonos at bay, the citizens of Abancay block the only bridge that would allow the colonos to cross the river and enter the town. By blockading the bridge, the townspeople attempt exactly what Butler declares to be impossible in a social body. Quote, for inner and outer worlds to remain utterly distinct, the entire surface of the body would have to achieve an impossible impermeability. This sealing off of its surface would constitute the seamless boundary subject. This enclosure would invariably be exploded by precisely that excremental filth that it fears, unquote. The effect of the bridge closure is devastating for the clean interior, as the colonos construct makeshift bridges to cross the river and receive mass. The fiery sermons that Father Linares had delivered work too well, as the colonos are determined to cleanse their souls before the plague takes their lives. The colonos cross the river and penetrate the sacred interior of Abancay society in an organized march, all the while singing in Quechua. In Arguedas's novel, the abject body makes itself visible by appropriating the very tools that were used to subjugate it. The chicheras taunt their oppressors with fecal matter, and in the case of the colonos, the fear of God that had been employed to keep them silent and submissive is the same fear that galvanizes them to demand, in Quechua, their rights. Arguedas's novel thus employs those same abject elements, feces, filth, tears, that are utilized to metaphorically establish and regulate an artificial social boundary in order to explode that boundary and make visible the possibility of an alternative social and political order. In Peruvian literature, poop becomes a means through which unjust social systems are unmasked as arbitrary and the politically disenfranchised are galvanized to demand rights. Thank you. And now I believe we're going to turn it over to Yankai for our final talk before we start our scat-venger hunt. So.
Okay, so I'm Yankai. So I personally don't do research related to manure or poop. So I just want to discuss several papers I read recently related to waste management from the mathematical perspective. So I'd like to first start with some background information. So the authors, they are from Wisconsin, which is known as America's dairy land. And apart from producing milks and cheese, this billion-dollar industry also produces billions of gallons of waste annually. And to give you some perspective, as we mentioned earlier, a single dairy cow can produce 62 kilograms of waste per day, which is about 10% of the weight of an average cow. And by the way, dairy cow also produces almost the same amount of milk per day. So the amount of milk produced from a dairy cow is almost the same as the amount of waste that is produced from it. And Wisconsin has more than 1 million dairy cows. And because of that, it has produced lots of manures. And manures is quite rich in lots of nutrition, especially something called phosphorus, and which makes it a good fertilizer. But the thing is, the supply of phosphorus is too much. It's way higher than the uptake capacity of the crops. And this map actually shows the excess phosphorus concentration in certain areas can be very high. So here, the imbalance ratio can reach up to 300. So imbalance ratio means the amount of phosphorus supplied versus the amount of phosphorus necessary for the land. So to make things even worse, the excess phosphorus can travel to those lakes from soil to water through those rains or surface runoffs, and this can cause harmful algae blooms in the water body. Okay, so specifically 1 kilogram of phosphorus can provide the growth of 110 kilogram of algae, and the algae can result into huge economic loss and threat our human health. And here we show 1 picture of algae bloom just in the lake next to Medicine last year. And you can imagine how, so Madison is the capital of Wisconsin, and you can imagine how bad the smell is in summer. So the key question the authors of this paper they want to answer is, where should they place waste treatment facilities, and which waste treatment technology should they select for each location? So for each location, they can select different kinds of technologies. So to give you an idea, an overview of waste treatment, it is a very complex system. So it involves subsystem like dairy farms, which produce tons of waste every day. And then there are croplands here, where this waste is applied for use as a fertilizer. But because of over application of the waste, it leads to nutrition runs off and resulting in algae blooms in the water body. So one option to manage this waste is to process it and recover some value-added products from the waste, from the poop, such as something called struvite, which is basically some fertilizer. And so it is a complex physical and chemical process. Also, one key issue here is logistic issues involved for transporting the waste. So you may ask, say, for example, the waste is a good fertilizer, so why not just ship some to the neighboring province or neighboring states? And the reason is because those dairy waste, besides the poop that also includes those milks that are not sold, it has maybe 90% of the waste is water. So transferring it for long distance does not make economical sense. So this is nothing but a supply chain problem from the mathematical perspective. So the authors say developed a compact way to model such complex supply chains. So they defined three major sets to model this supply chain network. So the set of nodes here, it represents the towns or cities such as Madison or Milwaukee. And then next is the set of products that captures all the products flowing through this network, such as the dairy waste, electricity, fertilizer, and so on. And then the set of links represents the flows between nodes, like from Madison to Milwaukee. And also it includes sets of sources and sinks that is basically the suppliers and consumers of those products. And finally, they have a set of technology that are the candidate technology that's available to process the waste. And here the main part of the model is a mass balance at a specific location for a specific product. And they also include logic constraints, that is constraints saying, for example, for this specific location, you cannot use this technology because of this reason. And finally, they also have capacity constraints to capture the limits associated with, saying, the supply or demand. Okay, so taking all this into consideration, the model is a huge model for the state of Wisconsin. And for processing the waste, there are different technologies available, and they also want to take into consideration of those different technology options. And the first step to in waste treatment is always this step. It's a digestion, and this would produce biogas and digest it. And you can directly sell the biogas, or what you can do is you can upgrade the biogas to produce things like electricity, biomass, or liquefied biomass, which is basically okay. So which is basically renewable fuels, and also for oh, sorry. So for digestate, similarly, it can be processed to different degrees to produce different products in different forms. So all these products has different market values and different costs. And then what also do is they input all the data into the model. So it include experimental data like the product yield, and also some economic data, such as the production cost. One thing very special about this model is they also specify the geophagic data, that is, for example, the location of those dairy farms. So building a large model is not very challenging, but building a huge model with real data is very challenging. And it's because collecting all this real data for the whole state, it is very tedious and time consuming work. And this model is then solved using some solvers. And then the solution of this model, most important, it can tell us where in this state should the technology be installed and what is the best technology to be installed for each specific location. Okay, so after obtaining the optimal solutions, what they also do is they did an economic analysis where they compare the market value of different products with the cost of generating those products from the waste recovery. And what they find is that these costs are higher than the current, these costs are higher than the current market price. So that means the recovered products are in the current market price. And they found that especially for electricity, the market price is 4 cents per kilowatt hour in US, where the cost is 18 cents to recover from the waste or from the manures. And this also explains why electricity recovery is a viable option in countries such as Germany, where the average price of electricity is about 35 cents per kilowatt hour. So in US, the unit price for electricity is quite low compared with Europe. So one way to close this gap, the authors argue, is to take advantage of the government incentives. So the authors, they consider different government incentives for renewable electricity generation and also renewable fuel generation. Okay, so the conclusion here is that with the government incentives, then all of a sudden it becomes profitable. And then the payback period, which means the amount of time it takes to recover the initial investment, is less than 5 years. So which makes it economically attractive. So here, this map shows the optimal location of this technology. So here, each red dot represents a dairy farm, which produce lots of manures. And a yellow ring here, it indicates a kind of technology combination that is installed in this location, where here's a green ring, it indicates another kind of technology combination installed in this location, while each blue arrow here means indicates the flow of manures between nodes. Okay, so from the optimization, you can get all these solutions. So after that, the authors published another paper in which they also taken the environmental cost or environmental loss into consideration. That is, they want to quantify the economic loss caused by the algae blooms if waste treatment facilities are not available, like what they have right now. So the first economic cost or economic impact of algae bloom is on the property value. That is, if you have a house on the beautiful lake shore, but if the water is infested with algae blooms, then the value of that property will, of course, it will reduce. So some researchers has already did some analysis to estimate the effect of algae bloom on the property value. So without going into too much detailed numbers, based on their calculation, every excess kilogram of phosphorus will result in a loss in property value of $26 US. And the second economic impact of algae bloom is on the recreational activities. That is, with algae blooms, then you will not like to do fishing or swimming there. And because of that, according to the authors, every excess kilogram of phosphorus will result in a loss in recreational activity of close to $45 US. And by combining all these things together, the author argues that the total amount of loss is around $74 US for every kilogram of excess phosphorus. And this also claims that this is actually an underestimator because they didn't take into consideration of lots of other effects. And from the model, what we can see is the author shows that the cost to remove all the excess phosphorus is only $45 per kilogram of phosphorus. So the key message here is that if we account for all the environmental costs, then the phosphorus recovery becomes technology start to make sense, even without the government incentives. Okay, so that's all I have today.
So shall we congratulate our winners and thank everyone for a lovely evening. We really appreciated your participation. Yeah. And we hope that you leave with a new sense of wonder for the scatological.
Yeah.